The NFL draft is over, so it's time to turn our sights back to fantasy football. And today, we're talking about rookie quarterbacks. Can we mine for gold in the rubble that is this year's quarterback class? We'll find out on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Worsley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Today, we're back talking fantasy football. After somehow managing to have the world's most accurate mock draft, I'm taking those skills and applying them to dynasty fantasy football. And we're starting off with the quarterbacks. And realistically, it's a pretty ugly quarterback class, but there could be some fantasy football gems in there. So we are going to go digging. Firstly, if you want to know my full rankings for all positions, you can just head over to ffdfantasyfootball.com. We are changing the site over this week, so you might have some outages this week, but for the most part, should be up and running after that. Also, be good if you could like and subscribe. We're going to be hitting up all the other football positions, then going into my full dynasty rankings over the coming weeks. Also, if you have any questions about your dynasty teams or your drafts, make sure you head over to Instagram or Twitter. Happy to answer your questions over there. But let's talk about quarterbacks for today. I'll be taking through each quarterback, talking about when you should take them in your fantasy drafts, and also talking about what I think of the player in general, and what's a generally reasonable outlook to expect from them. I will also be doing my What to Expect series in the coming weeks. Just need a little bit more time to get information on the players before working out what categories they each go in. Let's start off with Cam Ward, who is the clear number one quarterback in this class. It wasn't always that way, but during the process, it became very obvious that the teams viewed him that way. He's generally considered to be a good decision maker, but he's also a good scrambler. Not so much of a true runner. He's not a Jalen Milroe, so he's not fitting into that kind of Jalen Hurts or Lamar Jackson category, but he is someone who can get some extra yards with his legs. He's not going to be going on too many designed runs, I don't think, but you can expect him to get out of the pocket and either make plays or get downfield with his legs. And we know how valuable that is for fantasy football. If you're going to have a top 12 fantasy football quarterback, you generally want it to be someone who runs. Otherwise, you're going to really be relying on passing yardage, and that's very inconsistent relative to yardage with the legs. We've seen that with guys like Josh Allen over the years, where his legs are the thing that keeps him consistently as a top 2 quarterback. Cam Ward has that. What he doesn't have is the supporting cast around him. He doesn't have very good wide receivers. Calvin Ridley and Tyler Lockett are not really the guys you want to be relying on for your fantasy quarterback. But we're talking about dynasty. The Titans are going to rebuild. They are going to get better. Cam Ward is going to be the central guy in that. And I do think that he has the upside to be a top 12 fantasy quarterback in the long term. It's just going to take a little bit of time. So if you're in a real rebuild and you're needing a quarterback, he's a totally reasonable guy to get, especially in a super flex league. In a super flex league, I think it's reasonable to take him in the first round, but I wouldn't be taking him before guys like Ashton Genty, before the top wide receivers. Even before the next 3 quarterbacks, I probably wouldn't be taking Ward. Really depends on your exact needs. If it's a super flex league where there's 12 or 14 players in the league, then you might be considering Ward as high as 2, because quarterbacks are so valuable in those leagues. And he's the only guy that's really locked in as a starter this year. And that will make him valuable relative to the other positions. But you do have to understand, even for fantasy, Ward would probably be ranked somewhere between 4 and 7 in last year's class. So we're not talking about a typical dynasty quarterback value. He is lower than those other guys, so you do have to keep that in mind when drafting him. Jackson Dart ended up being the second guy off the board, and for me, I don't even think he is the second best quarterback, but he does have upside, bit of a gunslinger, okay accuracy, but he's not so much of a runner, and that's going to limit his fantasy upside. Conversely to Ward, who of course gains fantasy upside by his ability to be mobile. Dart's not someone who's going to consistently give you yards with his legs, and therefore you're going to need to rely on his passing. This is just not an offense that is going to offer that anytime in the near future. As good as Malik Neighbors is, realistically, Jackson Dart is likely always going to be, or at least in the majority of seasons, going to be somewhere in that 15 to 25 region. And that's only if he starts every game. And I think it's far from a guarantee he's starting anytime in the near future. We do know that as a general rule, quarterbacks taken in the first round are expected to start in their first or second year, and that'll probably still happen. It'll probably still be given an opportunity, but I would not be relying on the idea of him starting this year. I think Russell Wilson probably gets the first opportunity, and you can't fully discount Jameis Winston. Unless Dart looks absolutely fantastic in camp, I would expect that he's not someone you're going to be able to use in any sort of fantasy league in the near future. Might get his chances later on in the year once it becomes evident that the Giants aren't going to make the playoffs, and they near certainly won't. Now, if that happens, what can you expect from Dart? Well, I think you're expecting a mid-range quarterback, and for that reason, I wouldn't be drafting him even in a super flex league until second round, probably early-ish second round, depending on your needs. If you're thinking a couple of years in the future, I do think it makes sense to take Dart a little bit on the earlier side. But if you're in a win-now situation, probably waiting until late second round. And if you're drafting late in the second round, you hope you traded for that pick, because if you're a winning team, there is no point in having Dart on your roster unless you're absolutely desperate at quarterback and loaded everywhere else. In a non-Superflex league, by the way, I don't even think Dart has that much value at all. I'd be taking him in the later rounds. Even Ward, I think, is probably more of a late second, early third rounder. And Dart, we're thinking fourth round in a typical 12-team league. These guys just aren't quarterbacks that particularly interest me outside the deepest of leagues. If you're in a super deep league where you're talking like 16 to 32 teams, obviously these guys gain in value, but you ideally want a quarterback who's locked in to start long term. I think Ward's the only one there. So even in that sort of league, Dart isn't someone I'd be reaching for relative to the other positions. Tyler Shock, obviously, to the Saints, and it was a little bit of a shock. I don't know exactly what's going to happen here. It all comes down to what's going on with Derek Carr. It is starting to look more and more like Carr could be out, and if that happens to be the case, I do think it's probably the rookie that gets the opportunity, and for that reason, he is my third-ranked quarterback. But I can't say I love him. I don't know that the talent is really there. He's okay. He's a solid player. There's nothing massively wrong with him. He's got low mobility, though. I don't know that he's going to blow anyone's mind with his ability. He's basically a pocket passer who's going to sit there and inconsistently put the ball out to his receivers. He wouldn't go this high in the second round in any other year. I don't think he's someone that you really want in your dynasty team, unless it's super flex league, a slightly deeper super flex league, at least 12 teams. Then I'd be considering him third round into the fourth round, because I do think there is a realistic chance he starts this year. So if you're desperate for a starter this year, I do think that's an option you can take, but I'll be keeping my ear to the ground on Derek Carr news before actually making that call, because I do think if he's gone, then we do see the rookie get the starting spot. Jalen Milroe, on the other hand, has a lot more upside. I think he's significantly less likely to start ever. He's really very, very inaccurate and very raw. We're not talking about Jalen Hurts when he came out. We're talking like Jalen Hurts as a runner and someone absolutely terrible that doesn't really know how to throw a football as a passer. He's just that inconsistent. I know that he looks okay at times in college, but gosh, he played against some weak opponents in a system that really catered to him, and he still didn't manage to look that consistent or good. I'm very concerned about how that translates to the NFL, but his running ability will give him opportunities. Wouldn't surprise me if he comes in on some packages in a kind of Taysom Hill kind of way, not so much as a receiver, but as a runner who can also pass. But it's hard to see him turning into a starting quarterback, at least in the next year or two, especially because Seahawks did bring in Sam Darnold. I do think Darnold is going to be solid for their system. So for that reason, I wouldn't be expecting Milroe in the next year or two. But if you're in a league which has either taxi spots or deeper benches where you can afford to stash him, the upside is huge, because as we know, those running quarterbacks like a Lamar Jackson, it doesn't really matter how well they can pass. If they can get the starting role, they are gold for fantasy. That's all he needs to do. But I do think it's going to be difficult for him to get and maintain the starting role because his accuracy is just so low. Now, I did throw in the Brown guys here together. Typically, it would just be day 1 and 2 quarterbacks first, and then we talk about the day 3 guys later. But Shedeur Sanders, realistically, he should be brought in with these top guys because he is one of those top talents. I still have him as a top 2 or 3 quarterback in this class. I don't care what people in the NFL say. As a talent, he is probably top 2 for me. Very accurate, very tough. Pocket presence is very weak, and we all know that. Everyone's talked about that. The question is, what does it mean for fantasy? Realistically, teams pass on him because they don't want to have to deal with his dad. But if he can show up in camp, there are some opportunities here. I don't think Deshaun Watson probably plays for this team again if someone can take over this role and make it their own. That guy won't be Joe Flacco. He's going to be someone they try to go with early on in the year. And as soon as it becomes evident they're not going to be winning this year, I think he is gone by, I don't know, week 6, 7, 8. I do think Kenny Pickett probably gets the next chance. And I think it becomes evident very quickly that he is no good. And that's when they probably turn to Sanders. I don't think Dylan Gabriel is going to be involved at all here, but you do have to admit it is a very weak depth chart. And he was the day 2 player. And day two players are more likely to get an opportunity than a day 3 player in most situations. I just think this is an exception. I do think that Sanders is more likely to get the starting role, but it will probably happen later on in the season, maybe into next season, even depending on what happens with Watson. So Sanders is someone you can pick up and feel okay about his chances of starting this year. But again, wouldn't be touching him until the 4th round of a Superflex draft. And in non-Superflex, it'd have to be a deep league. It'd have to be 16 to 20 teams at least before I'd be thinking about Sanders in a 1 QB league. As for Dylan Gabriel, I mean, even in a super flex league, I don't feel good about him at all. He's small. He doesn't have any particularly amazing characteristics, doesn't have a particularly strong arm. He's not massively mobile. I don't see this working at all. I think he was very average at college in a very good situation. I think he's going to be so average in the NFL that he's not even a backup. I think this was a totally wasted pick, and I have no idea what the Browns were doing. Sanders was an okay pick in that range. Instead, they got him in the 5th, which was kind of a weird decision ultimately because it's always going to look weird. But I think that Sanders is the guy that's more likely to end up being the starter. Now, if you're in a deeper league and you are getting desperate for quarterbacks, let's talk about these guys who are kind of bench guys who have some upside to potentially start in the future. We'll also talk about kickers as well. Let's start off with Kyle McCord. For me, he's a guy that could have gone a couple of rounds earlier than this. I do think that Tanner McKee is probably still the backup, but McCord has the upside after being really productive in college to have an opportunity to be the number 2 guy. They only spent a 6th rounder on him, so it's not like they can't get rid of him. So he doesn't have that draft capital to keep him in the role, and that makes him very iffy. But I think even if he doesn't end up with the Eagles, he's going to end up with a team somewhere, maybe as a 3rd quarterback or on a practice squad somewhere initially. And I do feel like he's got the talent to potentially rise up through that. Problem is, it's not like he's an elite runner or anything like that. So he doesn't give you massive upside, even if he somehow ends up in a starting role somewhere. Even if he's a starter, he's still just going to be an average quarterback. You've also got Thompson Robinson on the bench there. And while I don't think that's a real concern, you do have to recognize that he technically trade for him. So it is possible something happens there as well. So McCord in a tricky situation, but he is probably the most talented of the quarterbacks here. Having said that, as you can see, I ranked him 8. I'm ranked him behind Will Howard and Dylan Gabriel. Gabriel's in a weaker depth chart, and Howard also has more opportunities, but McCord's clearly a better quarterback than both of these guys. In fact, I think McCord's probably 5th or 6th on the list on pure talent alone. Will Howard, on the other hand, at least has an opportunity. We don't know what's happening with Aaron Rodgers. In fact, most of the news about Aaron Rodgers at the moment is whether he's married or not, which is weird. I think realistically that Rodgers probably does sign with the Steelers, and if he doesn't, someone else probably does. But it's not impossible they go forward with Mason Rudolph. To me, that's kind of crazy because Mason Rudolph isn't very good. He's a solid backup. He can come in for a game or two, but he's going to get found out if you use him for the whole season. He's not going to be good enough in the playoffs, and the Steelers are very good at making the playoffs and not very good at winning there. So they need someone like a Rodgers. I know they're playing tough. I know they're playing brave and being like, oh, it doesn't matter. We're going to be fine either way. They're not. They do need Rodgers or someone else. I don't think Howard is the difference maker here, but I do think there's a non-zero chance that Rodgers doesn't sign for some reason. If that's the case, I can imagine Howard getting opportunities, and that means that he has more chance of being a starting quarterback at some point. I don't think he's particularly good. I don't like him as a talent. I don't think he was good at college, but he does have good mobility, even though he's a poor passer. And as we talked about with Milroe, people with good mobility do have the opportunity to get yardage with their legs, and they've got opportunities to survive in the pocket. So I feel like that gives Howard a little bit of upside. There were certainly rumblings of him going earlier than this. I heard some people ridiculously talking about him in the 1st round. That was never going to happen. But I do think it wasn't impossible the team would fall in love with him around the 3rd or 4th round. As it turns out, he dropped to the 6th along with a lot of other guys, and that's fine. I think that's the right place for him. But in this situation, there's definitely enough upside here to stash him in a deeper league that's super flex on your bench, or in a really super deep 32 team style dynasty league as well, where you have one quarterback. Riley Leonard, I'd like a little bit more, but it is hard to see him going past Richardson or Jones. I do feel like he was good value for the Colts there. I do think ultimately he tops out as a backup quarterback, but he's got some good size. He's got some upside, but he's got to get past both Richardson and Jones, and I think that's going to be a lot tougher. We're not talking about a situation where there's one good starter who can get hurt and all of a sudden he's got a realistic opportunity, a sort of 50-50 chance like with McCord. Or in the Howard situation where just Rodgers doesn't turn up and all of a sudden he gives himself a real chance. We're talking about a situation where both Richardson and Jones need to go down before they're even thinking about Leonard. For that reason, I think he's probably someone who ends up on the practice squad, has to develop. Anyone like that is a bit of a waste on your bench, but he's certainly got more upside than most of the other guys around him. Graham Mertz, I have no idea what the Texans were doing here. This is a dumb pick. It doesn't really make any sense. They did need a third quarterback, but there is no value in Mertz here. I've got nothing to say about this. Look, he would need 2 injuries ahead of him to have anything happen. And even then, he's going to be absolutely useless. I don't know what they were doing. But I also don't know what the Raiders were doing because they picked up Cam Miller. They also picked up Tommy Mellott. He's going to play wide receiver, which is why he's not here, even though he is listed as a quarterback in some places. But I don't understand why with neither of those picks in the 6th round, they picked up Quinn Ewers, who is clearly a more talented option, or even someone like a Seth Hennigan, who's signed as an undrafted free agent with the Jags. I've got him ranked ahead of Cam Miller. I don't know what they're doing with Miller here. This should have been a good opportunity because O'Connell is nothing special and could easily end up off the team. I may even already have by the time you're watching this. And Geno Smith, as we know, is nothing special either. So there is an opportunity here, but Miller is not going to be that guy. There is no upside here. This is a weird choice where they could have signed this guy as an undrafted free agent. Curtis Rourke, on the other hand, I mean, he's got good size, but I'm not really convinced by the talent. But when you've got size, when you've got those, when you've got that body shape, it is always possible things just click. So I do feel like Rourke could turn out to be okay. But he's behind Purdy. He's behind Jones. Neither of them is really special. And so Rourke could get an opportunity. And we know the 49ers, they're willing to give opportunities to 7th rounders. I do think, unless it's a rebuild, though, that's probably not going to happen. I think you probably need a Purdy injury and then a rebuild as well, where they're struggling this year before Rourke gets an opportunity ahead of Mac Jones. Finally, Quinn Ewers. I actually do like this situation. I think that we've seen that Zach Wilson is not someone who can be trusted as a starter. I think Tua Tagovailoa is one head knock away from being out entirely. I think Ewers could have gone rounds earlier than this. I think he looks solid at times at Texas. We know he's a winner. We know he can perform. Took him to the college playoffs multiple times. I don't understand why he's going so late here. I think this is a little bit of a weird one, and I still need to look a little bit more into why he's going this late. It just doesn't make sense to me because to me, he's probably better than all of these guys except maybe McCord. I would have had him going up where the Steelers were. I think they should have taken Ewers instead of Howard personally. Definitely ahead of guys like Mertz, Miller, and Rourke. For that reason, in this situation, I do feel like there's an opportunity. I feel like there's talent. He's someone that I'm happy to have on my bench in a very deep league. Finally, I also popped the kickers in here as well because there's only 2 of them and I had space and want to get them in here early. These are the only 2 guys that were drafted in the draft. There are other free agents who came in. I don't think any of them are a favorite to win their jobs. We might see some of them turn up. There's no reason to be getting either of those guys. But these guys, on the other hand, I mean, it's possible in a deeper league you might want a kicker. I personally prefer Borogalis. He is by far the better of the 2 kickers. I also think he's very likely to be the starter ahead of Romo, who is solid. The problem is Pat's kicker doesn't have a massive amount of value, but if the Pats are playing better, if Drake May starts to get it together, we know that they will kick the ball a lot. For that reason, I do like the upside there in a dynasty league where you kind of really do need to go about drafting kickers. Tyler Loop, on the other hand, I'm not convinced about. He's solid. I think it was reasonable to draft him. I don't know that I would have done it 4 spots after Borogalis, but I think this was a fine pick. We don't know what's happening with Justin Tucker, so it makes sense for them to pick up someone else. But I do think like his path to a starting spot is a lot harder to access. For that reason, I've got Borogalis ranked higher. And that's all we've got for the Dynasty Quarterback Show. Please make sure you hit me up on Instagram or Twitter or in the comments if you've got any questions about your team and want to know what to do in your draft. You can also hit me up for personalized draft advice as well in either of those places, or you can also email me at benwasley23@gmail.com. It would be great if you could like and subscribe, because you're going to want to know when these shows are coming out in the coming days with all the other positions too, because I've got some info, especially on the running backs and wide receivers, that are going to really help you in your dynasty leagues. Finally, if you want to know all my up-to-date rankings, especially my rookie rankings, while my dynasty rankings will be coming out in the next couple of weeks, make sure you go to ffdfantasyfootball.com. Look forward to chatting to you guys next time.